Chapter 64. Percy hesitated in the arched entryway, peering around the cavernous chamber which opened before them, and then actually took a step back, sidling partly behind Phenorixa. "It's okay," Phenorixa assured her. "If she didn't want people to enter, believe me, it wouldn't be possible. Just show some respect and courtesy and it'll be fine. She's not like my mother. Izyroa," she added, raising her voice so that it echoed across the great lair in front of them, "may we come in?" Of course. The dragon in residence was all the way down at the other end of her chamber, and currently in her smaller form, which made her look tiny at that distance. Her voice, however, projected clearly to them, in a manner that might have been augmented by magic, but could just be the craft of a skilled public speaker taking advantage of timekeeper acoustics. Phenorixa gently took Percy's hand in one claw, giving her an encouraging smile, and tugged her forward. "Come on, now. You've already talked with her. You know she's, well, reasonable. And not unkind." "I know," Percy mumbled. "But this is her home. Living here in Calm's chamber is one thing. Walking into a dragon's own lair. I'm still Valorfolk, Phenorixa." "Then maybe dragons and Valorfolk can start having a different kind of relationship. Who better to begin it than a princess?" Percy did not look particularly reassured by that. Still, she peered around in as much interest as trepidation as they made the long walk down the chamber's central aisle, taking in the huge Riva decorations, the displays of monuments and historical artifacts, and, in their own designated alcoves along the back half of the chamber, the treasure piles. "Welcome, Percy," Izyroa greeted them with a warm smile as they stepped into the alcove where she stood, and Phenorixa. "Please, come in. Make yourself comfortable." "Thank you," Percy said automatically, hesitating at the sight of the seats, a pair of Riva-style backless cushioned benches positioned facing each other, each half buried in a pile of pillows strewn about as if guests were expected to lounge on the floor or on the settees as they liked. The princess stared blankly at this arrangement until Phenorixa perched herself on one of the couches, gently pulling her down alongside. "Guests are a pleasure I do not often have," Izyroa said, seating herself opposite them. "And never here. My earnest congratulations on managing to pry Phenorixa out of the library, Percy. Please, help yourself." With a wave of one claw, she caused a tray of candied nuts, spice-rolled fruits, and braided twists of sugar-free bread to appear upon the low table set between the couches off to one side, along with a steaming pot of fragrant herbal tea and several cups. "Oh." Percy perked up in interest. "That's fascinating. Now did you bring that from somewhere else, or conjure it?" "Both methods fall within the domain of conjuration," Izyroa explained with a smile while picking up the teapot and a cup. "These are done by the latter method, crafted from pure magic, as it were." "Ah, of course. Our courtmage back home is a conjurer by specialization. It's funny, she never mentioned the difference." Taxonomy of anything tends to describe how people interact with things more than their essential nature, said Izyroa, pouring tea. Current magical practice describes any craft which causes the appearance of physical materials, whether created or brought from another location, as conjuration. As opposed to teleportation, which specializes in the transportation of living things via magic. Or summoning, which brings living and in some cases incorporeal beings from other planes of existence, or from other physical states. That this is the convention is happenstance. I'm sure you can see how each nuance might be categorized differently. There are some who argue they should be. But, wait. Percy frowned suddenly. If you can just make food from nothing, wasn't that entire big project with the trading guild and the portal much kind of pointless? Alas, conjured food is only good for snacks or emergencies, Izyroa replied. It lacks, let's call it, nutritional value. Any magically inclined hostess should have spells to conjure a few tasty treats, but I wouldn't try to keep a mortal on conjured food. They'll develop scurvy, and eventually can actually starve with a full stomach. The reasons are rather interesting, if you are already interested in magical practice. If your courtmage never found reason to go into it, I gather you are not? Cora definitely never explained any of that, said Percy, picking up a candied cashew. Phenorexa had already stuffed an entire bread twist into her face and was chomping with an ecstatic expression, holding a slice of cinnamon-coated date in anticipation of having room in her mouth. It doesn't have much to do with what I like, though. She doesn't really like questions or talking to people, I don't think. In fact, I hesitate to say so for sure because I'm often somewhat confused by people's motives. But over the years I have gained the strong impression she doesn't like me in particular. That follows, Isaiah said mildly, ignoring Phenorex's sudden scowl. I find you to be a fascinating young woman, Percy, but I am in general fascinated by, and fond of, within reason, people. Most of the very traits that make someone interesting to talk to are purely exasperating to a misanthrope. Traits in general are exasperating to misanthropes. It does not pay to take their umbrage personally. That makes sense, Percy agreed, nodding, then turned to Phenorexa. Oh. Is that how you get along with Shadrach? It helps, the young dragon admitted. I can't really explain why Shadrach likes me, or why he feels the need to pretend not to. Honestly, I started talking to him because at first he didn't dare teleport me to the bottom of the ocean no matter how much he wanted to, and that was very entertaining. That is called bullying, Phenorexa, Isaiah said pleasantly, and it is a leading cause of dragons getting themselves slain. For every dangerous mortal like Shadrach there are 5 who are equally dangerous and lack his forethought or regard for consequences. Do as you will, but I gently request a modicum of regard for those of us who will have to weather Imalafine's tantrums if you get murdered. I don't think I would survive that, Percy said, turning a reproachful frown on Phenerexa. More importantly, I would be devastated if you got murdered. Please exercise some care. Phenorexa gaped at each of them in turn, visibly struggling to form a cogent response. I have been meaning to inquire, Percy, Isaiah continued as serenely as ever as she handed Percy a teacup, since you seem likely to be more recently informed than I, are you aware of any development toward establishing regular contact with the inhabitants of Nemix too? Percy suddenly sat up straighter, shaking her head negatively even as her expression brightened. Oh, goodness, no, that would mean someone had surpassed the light speed constraint, which would turn all of magic and the natural sciences on their heads. You are aware of the light speed, what am I saying? Of course you must be, that's been known to science for centuries. Well, since teleportation moves at close to the speed of light, it only seems instantaneous here on our world, and for all practical purposes is, but at greater distances the length of travel becomes impracticable. Nemix is 18 light-years away, and no one to my knowledge has figured out how to build and cast a teleportation spell that will hold together in transit for anywhere close to that long. Which is such a shame, because the math is eminently doable, it's complicated, but there's no reason it should be impossible to calculate the trajectory, and that would be the greatest achievement. But currently, we can't even put a scrying beacon on Gallimard, which is only 5 light-years away. Getting people almost 4 times that distance is far beyond out of the question as things stand. And even aside from that, there's the problem that any information the most advanced diviners are able to get from Nemix is also 18 years old, and at that distance scrying is extremely vague and there's no telescope that can see details physically, enchanted or otherwise, so anyone who managed to get there would be going in effectively blind. Percy paused for breath, and then her expression changed again, eyebrows drawing together in sudden consternation. Phenorexa, who was watching her fixedly with an expression that was hard to read due to her bulging mouthful that she had apparently forgotten to chew, also frowned in response. Isaiah sipped her tea. A pity. That was the state of things when last I looked into it, but it has been some time and I dare to wonder. But as you point out, progress on that front is bumping up against a universal law. Ah, well. Are you making fun of me? Percy inquired. That's a serious question. I have historically failed to notice. I was not, Isaiah said immediately. In my opinion, The only use of mockery is to exchange it with a close friend who enjoys the repartee. All others should be treated courteously, or destroyed without warning. What gave you the impression that I might be, if I may ask? Some people seem to find it amusing to get me to talk about things I'm interested in, Percy said quietly. I suddenly had the realization that you were probably aware of all this, and also probably aware that most topics related to astronomy aren't subject to frequent change. And? I don't know. Why ask? If one knows what to look for, Isaiah said with a gentle smile, getting people to talk can reveal much that is of interest regardless of the actual content of their speech. And no, Percy, I was not seeking to embarrass you. Nor will I, ever. Tell me, do people say the way you look at them is creepy? Percy cringed, hunching her shoulders, and Fenurixa turned a baleful look on the elder dragon, who ignored her. Sorry, the princess whispered. Was I doing it again? You have done nothing whatsoever to discomfit me, Isaiah assured her. Let me guess, and do please correct me on any point I mistake. First people insist that you make eye contact when speaking to them, then when you comply, insist that you are doing it wrong, and can't explain why. Yes. Percy exclaimed. How did you? Oh, this is what Colin talked about. You know things. A few things, here and there, Isaiah said with an amused smile. You stare, fixedly and directly, into my pupils when speaking to me. Yes. What else do people want? I don't. When people watch one another's faces during conversation, the dragon explained, they're looking for the tiny, almost unnoticeable movement of facial muscles, largely around the eyes and mouth, but mostly the eyes, hence the demand. The nature of facial expression is largely involuntary, unless one has been trained to exert facial control, so nuances of emotion cause these tiny movements, which they then observe and interpret. Often incorrectly, but the instinct is powerful. Even if the information thus gathered is less than useful, the absence of the gathering is immediately noticed. And all of this is subconscious and instinctive. Most people have no idea they are doing it. Hence their inability to explain it, or to articulate what exactly is wrong when someone is not doing it. Percy stared at her, mouth slightly open. Fenurixa frowned at her in concern, hesitantly raising a claw, then seemed to realize she was still holding a handful of candied nuts. Try this, Isaiah said, leaning forward and widening her eyes. See the points around the eye where small muscles tend to visibly move in response to emotion? Those are the points of interest. Both corners of the eye, and of the eyebrow, the edges of the upper and lower lid, and the iris and pupil, when they subtly shift to focus on similar shifts in your own face. Look directly at each of these, alternating between them in a randomized pattern. That will approximate the natural effect closely enough that most people won't notice the difference. Belatedly, Percy closed her eyes. For a second her hands shook enough that her tea very nearly sloshed over, but she quickly regained control. But that's so simple. Percy's voice was a bare whisper, opening her eyes again to stare at some point in infinity past Isaiah's shoulder. It's just a trick. Can't it really be that simple? Nobody ever. No one ever told me. They didn't know, Percy, Isaiah said gently. I have spent far more of my life not knowing about this than knowing, and I know of it only because I have happened into a position wherein I had access to the research of an empire's greatest natural philosophers. This is instinct, a thing people tend to just do, which is nonetheless outside their awareness. No one was trying to keep it from you, of that I am certain. Percy focused back on her face, nodding once. Then. I'm sorry, I have to ask, it's been troubling me for so long. What about the way I look at people is creepy? I feel like if I just understood why. Scientific practice is better suited to tell us what and how than why, Isaiah cautioned. Some of the whys it can deduce, yes, the simpler ones. We are talking about minutiae of biology and psychology, the products of uncountable nuances which are themselves poorly understood, and whose roots lie back in the infinite mists of deepest time. In such matters, Even the wisest sage can answer why only with conjecture. But I do have a theory which has held up to query thus far. If you accept the limits of it, that this is not truth but supposition, I can share it. Percy nodded eagerly. Please. In the ancient past, when the most distant ancestors of mortal races were lesser beings which had not yet developed speech, much less tools or magic, they were all animals, in essence. And in the animal kingdom, to stare fixedly at something is the act of a predator about to strike. I theorize that an ancient warning lingers deep in the instincts of mortals, making them sense danger in an unblinking, unmoving stare. Truthfully, she added with the slightest smile, I had discerned this long before I ever encountered research into the topic of mental variance. In the craft of rule, it is often useful to make people cower with only a look. Being a dragon is sort of cheating, in that regard, Phanerexa pointed out. Izyroa nodded at her, still smiling. Quite. But I have seen the trick work just as well for mortals. That is too rapid, Percy, and too regular, it looks unnatural. Give it at least a second between shifts, and try to vary the length of the interval. In fact, the best approach is to watch for subtle movements around the eye and then look directly at whatever tiny muscle you just saw twitch. That is what the natural method does, and will be indistinguishable to most. Ah, okay. Percy nodded seriously, frowning in concentration. All right, that's not quite as simple a trick as I was thinking. I'm going to have to work on this. I mean, practice it. There are several here with whom you can rehearse, Izyroa said warmly. You are always welcome to visit me, and my husband loves little more than talking with people. And I am sure Phanerexa would be delighted to practice with you. Of course, I love talking, I mean, I enjoy our conversations, Phanerexa said, trailing off awkwardly. Percy, still frowning in contemplation at her recent discoveries, didn't appear to notice anything amiss in her response, and Izyroa did her the kindness of pretending to have seen nothing. Do you? Percy hesitated, swallowed, and set her chin in a resolute expression before continuing. Empress Izyroa, do you think you can teach me to be normal? I would do anything in my power. My first lesson to you, which I shall give for free even if it proves the last, is that you should attempt to move beyond the idea of normal. I am no philosopher, nor a scientist, priest, or a healer. I am a pragmatist. I deal in the realm of what works, and it has long been my experience that normality is both relative and subjective. When you speak of being normal, you are talking about fitting into a specific cultural context, and no, I would not deign to teach you that, Percy. It is simply not worth the time or effort. Rather, I would teach you the craft of understanding social contexts in general and fitting into them, or not, as you need and desire. That is a practical skill. Blending in and fitting the dictates of whatever culture you may need follows from it naturally. There is a fundamental difference between being able to do so according to your own needs, and being required to do so by the dictates of others. That difference is power, and power is my craft. I see, Percy said slowly, still frowning. Tell me, Percy, Izyroa asked, tilting her head and regarding the young woman with an intent but serene expression. If I did teach you to pass for, let us call it conventional in your culture, what would you do with that skill? I would be useful, Percy answered immediately, leaning forward in such avid earnestness that Phanerexa had to quickly grab her teacup to prevent it spilling. I could go home and repay everything that's been given to me. I want to be the princess they always wanted, someone who contributes to the kingdom and makes my family proud. Is that truly your ambition? Izyroa asked. Consider that you have options, now, which may not have been available to you before. I recognize you have understandably been preoccupied first with what this change in circumstances imposed upon and taken from you, and more recently, with putting together the necessities of daily life. Beyond that, however, you enjoy new possibilities. No less than the Golden Empress of Rivak has placed herself in your debt. The doors open to you are endless. Would you like to be an astronomer, living and working at peace, with your own well-equipped observatory in my empire, attended by fellow scientists instructed to accommodate your particular needs?" Percy let her mouth fall open for a second, her eyes going wide and for just a moment seeming to glimmer with stars of their own. The pure wonder and hope suffused her entire face. Fenorixa stared at her with an oddly similar expression, biting her lip. But then the princess's expression fell, closed off again. With visible reluctance, she shook her head. "I could never. As much as that's everything I ever dreamed of, if I did that, I would never feel any better than I do right now. I'd never stop hating myself. Please understand, Izyroa, I'm a thief. I've lived in greater luxury than most people can ever imagine, through no merit of my own. And I've done nothing. All I ever do is cause trouble and make people clean up my messes, and contribute nothing to anyone. I was resigned to it. But if you really want to offer me possibilities, new futures, that is the only one I can reach for. I need to repay my family, my country, my people. If I could only be the princess they need, I could accept any other disappointment in life." Izyroa regarded her, smiling but silent, for a heartbeat, and then bowed her head deeply. "There cannot be such a thing as a right answer to the question I asked you, Princess Perseverance, but to my way of thinking, the answer you just gave is the best one. And yes, I can indeed help you with that. Nor will I do so merely out of obligation stemming from my son's actions, but because I believe, earnestly, that you are worth the effort, and that the journey will be as gratifying for me as for you." "I don't know about that," Percy said nervously. I think you might not want to get your hopes up too high." "I learned long ago how to correctly estimate the proper height of a hope," Izyroa replied with a smile. "To reiterate, Percy, I have no intention of teaching you to pass for someone who does not have your unique condition. Not only am I not a mind healer, I don't consider that worth doing. You have a package of traits, as does everyone. Some must be overcome. Others can be leveraged. If you wish to study with me, we will explore your capabilities, and find the best path for you to achieve the goals you desire. A healer I may not be, but I have met and dealt with countless people during my long years, and I find them endlessly fascinating. Even if the process is slow and we must fumble for every step, I am confident I can help you find a path forward." "I'm just not. I don't know," Percy said worriedly. "Leveraged. I don't think that I have particular advantages. I'm still kind of grappling with the suggestion that I might not actually be crazy, or stupid, or morally deficient." "I cannot see into your heart or mind," Izyroa said gently. "I judge people by their actions. In the short time you have been here, I have seen you under the most extreme duress, and in that time you have consistently been considerate of others, curious about your surroundings and eager to learn despite your very reasonable fear. The very first moment we met, you pushed through terror and trauma to consider the bigger picture, form a plan, and carry it out. If I am any judge of people, Percy, which I am, your character is most admirable indeed." The elder dragon shifted gracefully forward to the edge of her seat, reaching out to gently take one of the now stammering princess's hands in her glittering claw. "Based upon everything I have been able to interpret, your family did their best for you, Percy. They simply were not in a position to provide what you needed. I have assets they do not. Perhaps I cannot teach you to be the princess they wanted, but it matters little. I don't intend to try. What I plan is to help you discover what kind of queen you have it in you to be, and help you become her." Percy squeezed her claw, smiled broadly, opened her mouth, and burst into tears. "Oh no," she blubbered, scrubbing at her eyes with a sleeve. "And not again. First fainting and now. Ugh, you must all think I'm so pathetic." Izyroa glanced at Fenorixa, who was staring at Percy and making helpless little gestures of dismay with her own claws as she couldn't seem to figure out what to do. The elder dragon chuckled softly. "I guarantee, Percy, no one here thinks that. Chapter 65. No poetic license had been exercised in the naming of Whitewell Ravine, but the place itself was lovely enough that it didn't need better marketing. The ravine was much wider than it was deep. From their perch atop a rocky outcrop a short distance from its edge, the party could see most of the bottom. Colin was no geologist. He couldn't even identify the white stone which gave the canyon its name, though he was reasonably sure it wasn't limestone or marble, but he thought the whole formation looked geologically young, especially considering there was a river running through it. The white rocks were stark and sharp-edged, forming crags and jagged corners rather than the smooth, rounded surfaces of stone which had been shaped by eons of water. Even the river, though it appeared to be neither deep nor fast, was stirred into occasional eddies by sharp outcroppings of stone here and there. Now, though, the natural beauty of the ravine was overshadowed by a single spectacle, one no less beautiful, but one which clearly didn't belong in the surrounding desert. "Would you look at the size of it?" Elizabeth breathed. It was a plant, apparently a single plant. Sprouting from a point in the very middle of the river, it was an enormous bulb of translucent red flesh, encased in a honeycomb-like lattice of beige woody growths, each bristling with fronds which quivered in the breeze. The entire egg-shaped main bulk of it was bigger around at its base than a modest house, rising to a height that looked to Colin greater than the slender palm trees from back home, its peak a fuzzy forest of those same fronds which protruded from its wood casing. From its base, where it rose from the water, extended its many enormous vines, green tendrils as thick around at their root as the ancient trees he had seen in the forest of Boisford. They had no leaves and didn't branch off, each tendril snaked out alone from the core plant, crawling across the surface of the water or dipping beneath it, climbing up the ravine walls so that they extended out across the rocky plain to either side. Gigi scooped up a loose rock from the ground, wound up her entire body and hurled it at the nearest of the plant's tendrils. She had an impressive arm. The stone flew straight and hit hard enough that the meaty thunk echoed off the rocks. Instantly, the vine curled up into a loop around the spot where it had struck, and huge thorns, nearly as long as a hairy was tall, sprang out of the green flesh in which they'd been hidden, forming a brutal encirclement that would have shredded anything caught within the coil. As the group watched in silence, that coil began moving down the entire length of the vine, back toward its base. The vine curled, and wherever it rose into that constraining loop, more of those thorns emerged into its center, growing in size as it got closer to the core. The entire plant shivered as the loop finally reached the core, diving under the surface of the water to deposit its non-existent burden at the roots. "And that's how a cactus gets nutrients," Naren explained. "Some carnivorous plants are sort of clever, a few are even sentient, but not this. That's a pure physiological reflex. Anything that disturbs one of the limbs triggers that reaction. It coils them up like a snake and rolls them all the way back to the base. Along the way those spines shred the victim until it's just a mass of torn meat being deposited at the roots, for a fast and easy nutrient extraction. And the gore left along the limb attracts scavengers, and thus, more food. It's as brutally elegant as only nature can be." "What's it doing here?" Elizabeth asked. "I thought cacti were wetland plants." "They are," Naren said, scowling. "And in wetlands, a cactus is part of the ecosystem. It has competition for resources, much of its prey is adapted to evade it at least some of the time, and there are even animals that eat them, both above and below the water. In its normal habitat you'll rarely see one with a central body bigger than, say, a pumpkin. Here, that thing is creating an absolute massacre of savanna fauna that have no idea how to deal with it. For dryland animals, anything that big and green just looks tasty. It's already devastated the local antelope herds before they left the area, wiped out all the nearby crocodiles, decimated the fish upriver from this spot. Not to mention cutting off access to the only water source in the vicinity, and shutting down river travel. There are a couple of hairy tribes that live on rafts, mostly going up and down this river, and they've had to learn new lifestyles in a hurry. Even worse, this has ripple effects all up and down the food chain. In this area the puma and sand monitors have gotten hungry enough to get awfully bold around caravans. This damn thing has gorged itself on basically every living creature in its environs. That's how it got so big. But this is a dry area. This spot along the river isn't exactly desert, but it's close, and there's basically nothing left for it to devour. It's already shrunk a bit from its greatest extent. The plan last I heard was for the tribes to let it starve a while longer, let it shrink and weaken, and then try to do something about it before the balance tips back the other way and creatures start coming back and getting eaten. Do something about it, Gigi scoffed. You say the plan as if they actually have one. What is it doing here, though? Colin asked. I don't even know where the closest swamp is, but surely not within. Well, I don't get how one even found its way here. Naren's scowl deepened. They don't normally grow in running water. A seed would have to have been pushed by the current up against the rock that would keep it from being swept away, but in a spot with mud, non-sandy mud, a rarity in this river, at exactly the right depth where it got some sunlight. The most plausible part is that a formation like that would naturally accumulate detritus the sapling could feed on. And that's assuming a cactus seed was here in the first place. It is not technically impossible that a migratory bird or something might have dropped it. And all of that had to happen right at the start of the dry season, so it could get its first growth spurt while there was no river traffic, and no Harry recognized what the thing was and got rid of it before it got too big. Why, you sound downright suspicious, Vadaril, she commented, bending her neck to grin down at him. Naren lashed his tail once, and nodded. I am. Like I said. This is something which could, theoretically, occur by chance. I'm not one to trust incredibly specific and convenient, or inconvenient, in this case, coincidences. Yeah, me either, Gigi added, but the other side of that coin is I can't for the life of me figure out why someone would do this on purpose. This achieves nothing and doesn't harm anybody but the Harry, and we don't have any enemies. Out west in the dells not everybody has even heard of Harry, and more of them than otherwise were surprised to learn what we look like. What's the point of messing with the tribes? It's not like our land's even worth taking. The only polity in a position to seize our land would be Rivak, Naren added, and Izyroa has laws protecting us. Even if she changed her mind for some reason, she would send an army, not play vicious pranks like this. So no, while I'm suspicious, I don't exactly have any suspects. Wizards, Vadaril, she said sagely, nodding her huge head. I bet a wizard did it. They're always just doing stuff, man. Who knows what they think? It's like Fenurix's friend, you know what a buckthall he is. This in particular isn't Shudrak's style, Colin mused, but if he's indicative of wizards in general, I could see one of them being enough of a dickhead to think this was funny. Present company accepted, of course. Sorry, Isabet, no offense meant. Ah, we will not be repeating any part of this conversation to your Antum, by the way. Does he think we're stupid? Venomix huffed at his sister, then turned his head to scowl down at Colin. You just think we're stupid, don't you? Well, be fair to the guy, Vadaril, she said reasonably. He has met us. Her brother hissed at her, but it was a desultory gesture with no real heat. It caused Isabet to dive to the ground and cover her head, though. The issue is, Gigi said, this thing requires either specialists or overwhelming firepower to deal with, and the Harry in general have neither. They also tend to be pragmatic and conflict-averse, Naren interrupted, giving her a pointed stare. Gigi made a face at him. That's also how I was gonna put it, no need to be defensive. So, fortuitously, here you guys are now. Godling, Cryomancer, and heckin' dragons. I've gotta be honest, Colin said immediately, I don't see me being much use here. My powers are incredibly specific in nature, and I don't see how they'd apply to this. Mine are specifically applicable, Isabet said, still dusting herself off after getting back up. Actually, pacifying dangerous warm climate flora is one of the classic jobs of an ice mage. Most equatorial plants will fall dormant if not outright die if you chill them enough. The trouble is the sheer scale of that thing. I don't have the raw power to freeze the entire river. Or even the entire plant, I don't think. But if I chill one vine at a time, that'll clear a path to the central body. Okay, whoa, hold up, said Gigi, raising both hands in a quelling gesture. Doll, I love your enthusiasm, but hang on. Doll? Isabelle muttered incredulously, folding her arms. We're specifically gonna need you to conserve that mojo for the end of the operation, Gigi continued. Remember, bag of holding? Securing monster meat? Cactopus flesh is crazy good stuff, depending on how you process it, it's both edible and useful for fibers. Makes ridiculously strong rope and fabric once dried out, or it can be cooked up fresh for a tasty and nutritious meal. Just gotta separate the fibers from the meat and pull out the spines. But those vines curl up and sprout spikes as a reflex, remember? They'll still do it even when severed. So they gotta be chilled before we can safely store 'em. Luckily, we won't need you to actually take the thing out, because, why no? She half turned and made a broad gesture at the two dragons, grinning. Vadaril she stepped away from the group, trotting out in a wide arc toward the outer edges of the nearest cactopus tendril, which was nowhere within range of them, Narin having selected their vantage point with caution. Be careful, Cullen called out as she bent forward, extending her neck toward the tentacle. Vadaril she looked over at him, then rolled her eyes so ostentatiously it tilted up her entire head. Then she lunged forward, snapping her jaws closed on the end of the tentacle. It instantly went rigid as it tried to curl up, but was unable. The dragon holding the other end dug her claws into the ground and pulled backward with all her strength. Since she was a dragon, the fact that it was an immediate stalemate alarmed Cullen. Vadaril she growled, all four legs braced and hauling back against the cactopus, looking for all the world like an enormous dog refusing to relinquish a toy. The cactopus limb vibrated along its whole length, still trying stubbornly to coil up in response to the disturbance. For a few tense seconds they were locked in that struggle. And then, abruptly, Vadaril she was yanked forward as the sandy ground gave out under her weight. She slid a few paces, scrabbling furiously to regain her footing, before the tentacle broke off in her jaws with a snap clearly audible to the nearby onlookers. Apparently the combination of intense tension and dragon teeth was too much even for tough cactopus fibers. Immediately Vadaril she jerked back, barely catching her balance by pumping her wings before she was tipped over backward, and the rest of the tentacle whipped into a huge coil. As before, the loop traveled swiftly along its entire length back to the plant's center, bristling with spines as it went. Bah! I coulda had it if the ground wasn't so loose, Vadaril she complained, trotting back to them. Still, though, damn. You weren't kidding, Gigi, about the toughness or the taste. I wouldn't mind chewing on some more of that. Well. Yeah, Gigi said, nonplussed. Think of it like a snake that size, except proportionally stronger. You're talking about wrestling with a python big enough to swallow you, which. Don't do that. If you were just a big critter with claws I wouldn't have suggested it. What were you trying to do there, exactly? Just breathe fire at the thing. Oh. Venomox drawled, arching his neck. And what about the rest of your plan, to preserve the tentacles for harvesting? That's hardly an option if we burn the entire thing to a crisp. Well, just don't burn the entire thing, then, Gigi retorted in mounting frustration. Come on, look at the size of it. The only thing that needs to get taken out is the central part, and that's the least useful anyway. Hit it and spare as many tentacles as you can, and boom. Done, profit. Hells, you wouldn't even need to blast a path to it. Can't you just roast the thing from above? Well, that's hardly anything at all, Vadaril she protested. That's, like, cheating. You know what's cheating? Gigi shouted. Being a dragon. Why complain about it now that there's actual stakes on the table? Venomix silently invoked some complex and powerful magic and Colin whirled to face him in alarm, but the dragon was just accessing some kind of interdimensional storage, like a personal bag of holding except not tied to a physical bag. He made his preserved flower garland disappear into it, then stretched, flicking his wings once and rolling both shoulders. "What do you think?" he rumbled, turning to Vedalshi. "Pick opposite ends to approach. First one to get to the center and tear it up?" "Better be adjacent ends," she said, "that'll mean less wasted booty. Remember we're doing this for the Harry. And to help Colin and Isabet impress Iamat." Iamat is the patron deity of a pragmatic culture, Naren interjected. "She won't be impressed by anyone clowning around when there's serious work to be done." "Save your breath," Colin muttered. "Right," Venomix agreed, disregarding the mortals entirely. "No fire breath, no magic." "You're on," Vedalshi crowed. In unison, both dragons turned and gumbled out in a wide arc to approach the cactopus's zone of control from relatively even starting points. "Wow, that's not even ignoring us," Gigi said, deadpan. "It's like they just selectively stop hearing." "Isn't that what ignoring is?" Isabet asked. "Take an aristocrat," said Colin, "an archwizard, and an average teenager, multiply them by each other, and that's roughly the amount of not listening to sensible advice you get in a young dragon. Well, I guess I'd better go supervise this. They are sort of my responsibility, after all." "Okay, cool," said Gigi, still deadpan. "And do what, exactly?" "Gods, I hope I don't have to figure out an answer to that," Colin grumbled, stalking off after his monstrous centenarian stepchildren. They hunkered down behind an outcropping on one of the surrounding mountain ledges, able to see nothing but stone and a few errant patches of lichen. This little patch of Dragon Vale was so desolate one could almost forget the huge, verdant valley spread out just beyond the immediate rock wall, well, usually verdant. Masaur didn't know whether its current half-burned state was significant, but that was not his job. He was here to document more specific information, and that was not going well. "Is it not working?" his mission leader asked calmly. Leaders always projected calm. The sovereign had very specific ideas about leadership, and overly emotional people did not tend to rise in the ranks in Shamasar. "I think it should be," Masaur said, mastering his own mounting frustration with effort. The object in his hands resembled an abacus with a slab of mirrored bronze replacing the racks of beads, currently projecting strings of numbers. "I'm sorry, sir, I've never worked with one of these before. As far as I can tell it's working, but what it's telling me is nonsense. Nia, I don't suppose you know?" The other mage shook her head apologetically. "Sorry, not my specialization." Well, that was fair enough. Masaur hadn't worked with either of these individuals before. The mission leader, Nasher, was from the capital. Nia was a portal mage stationed in Rivkablet like himself as part of the diplomatic messenger and emergency transit relay system, and he was an enchanter who also worked at the embassy. He had seen Nia around, but not spoken to her. Masaur was perhaps overly conscious of how it would look for a portly middle-aged fellow like himself to go around chatting with attractive younger co-workers. If he didn't know how this thing worked, a portal mage wouldn't. "It's supposedly state-of-the-art, which I suspect is the problem," Nasher said, patting his shoulder. "Sorry, it's not your fault. Equipment should always carry documentation and not be issued to people who haven't been trained on it. That's policy. Somebody above my head decided this was urgent and pulled out all the stops, and here we are. What problem are you having with it, exactly?" "Well, I'm trying to get it to document the local life signs, as you requested," Masaur explained, hunching over the enchanted device again and frowning in concentration. "I've done 2 scans, the first one insisted we were in a lifeless desert, and the second recorded a population that would fit a metropolis. As far as I can tell, everything should be working perfectly. I've checked the enchantments on it and while I don't know exactly how they relate, I can tell they're stable. You can always tell that malfunctioning enchantments always cause splash effects of some kind. Usually they're noticeable even before you have an enchanter dig into the workings. If we were back in my office at the embassy I could figure it out, I'm sure, but on the fly. I don't know why it isn't working. It looks like it's working, but what it's doing. You have it miscalibrated. What? Frowning more deeply, he raised the device till his nose was almost touching it. It was always easy for him to lose himself in an interesting job. That was why he normally worked in an office rather than the field. How? I checked for controls first thing. It doesn't look designed to be adjusted. It was probably designed with general circumstances in mind. Life signs are not an actual thing in any of the magic systems that went into that thing's creation, so it's extrapolating from ambient magic. There's an ancient lair of dragons right across the valley, there, so the ambient magic is very different from whatever its designers intended. For some reason, Nashir began tugging on his sleeve, but Masauer was already lost in magic analysis and paid the gesture no mind. Oh, I believe you're right. This does present an interesting problem. Now, if this were a gadget I'd build I'd know exactly how to fix that. I'm afraid to tweak its spell matrix without that kind of familiarity. It looks expensive. Yes, that seems like a task for a laboratory. Now, in the field, you can often compensate for flawed data by comparing it to another reference point. For example, set it to analyze ley lines instead of life signs, and you'll be able to see a depiction of how magic is flowing in the valley. A specialist like yourself can doubtless use it to make educated guesses concerning the population count you were looking for. Well, it's an idea. It would be terribly imprecise, but I'm afraid we might have to settle for that. Oh, Nashir, what are you? Nashir was now squeezing his arm with increasing force, until the point it had begun to hurt. His concentration broken, Masauer now belatedly realized that the voice with which he'd been conversing was not Nashir's, or Nia's. Slowly, he raised his head, and turned it. Both his compatriots were staring upward in frozen terror. Imer Alafine the White Wind had arrived in utter silence, clinging to the mountain face above them. Her enormous triangular head lowered enough that she looked like she could flex her neck and snap them up in her jaws. They were big enough. Let me see if I can extrapolate from incomplete data, she said, grinning. Masauer felt the blood rush from his head and was quite proud of himself for not actually fainting in such proximity to all those teeth. The dragon reached out with one enormous claw and, with absolutely astonishing delicacy, tucked its razor tip under the insignia on Nashir's uniform, subtly tilting it. Shamasar. I surmise that my ill-behaved offspring created some manner of spectacle when visiting one of your cities? Her or one of her silly little friends. If Savasmitter has some manner of grievance to raise, he can come do it with me in person. I am reasonable enough to make my Fenurixa pay for her own mistakes, and I should think my reputation makes that clear. If he has none, and was simply curious what she was up to, I will reassure you now that she was simply there to shop, and the business is now concluded. The white dragon flexed her neck, shifting her head so that one side was positioned in front of them, close enough to touch, which, needless to say, they did not. The single, slitted blue eye now studying them from up close, like a laboratory student examining the contents of a sample dish, blinked its horizontal inner lid once. And it had better remain concluded, Imer Alafine continued. Savasmitter is running some kind of country, he should expect people to visit. And when people visit and do nothing but drop some coin into his economy, he has no cause to get tetchy with those people's parents. I am an altogether different sort of dragon, as are all those who reside here. We like our solitude, and our privacy. I am giving you this message to convey to your master as a courtesy between dragons. With this addendum, if any more of his playthings come creeping about my back steps, he will not be getting them back in the condition in which I found them. She raised her head again, now gazing down upon them with a supercilious expression from the height of a minaret. Should there then be a third abrogation of my privacy instigated by Sava's Mitter, I will take it upon myself to personally give him some pointers on draconic etiquette. And this discussion will occur in Shamasar, not Dragonvale. I, just for your reference, am not my daughter. I do not wait in line at the customs office. The scrying device suddenly leaped from Masara's numb fingers, flying into her grasp. I am confiscating this, obviously, Imar Alafin said primly. At a glance I can see a dozen ways this design is a failure, but the underlying principles appear to be quite state-of-the-art, and I shall gain some hours of entertainment from analyzing them. Sufficient that I believe I shall forgive this trespass, provided there are no repetitions. Give Sava's Mitter my regards and my message, unless you are not actually his pawns and this was some manner of false flag exploit meant to implicate him. In which case, good luck. Magic roared around them, and all three found themselves forcibly jerked through a world which suddenly blurred to oblivion. Mansur landed painfully on his shoulder and hip, skidding across what proved to be a polished marble floor. Shouts and stomping feet were everywhere, followed within seconds by alarm bells, the hiss of blades being drawn, and a familiar guardsman's whistle. "Ow!" Nia complained. Adding horizontal velocity to a simple teleportation? Bloody impressive and not bloody necessary. "Identify yourselves," barked a voice which was clearly in no mood for nonsense. Masara managed to roll onto his back, wincing. He had definitely done something worse than a bruise to his shoulder in that landing. He could see the ceiling now, and some of the walls. This was the throne room. The sovereign's throne room, in Shamasar. She'd flung them halfway around the world, straight through several of the most thorough ward networks in existence. "I am Nashir Palmata of the 4th Bronze Corps," his team leader said. "Apologies for this breach in protocol, Lieutenant. I'm afraid it was not within my power to halt. I request medical attention for my team. And, if someone would kindly notify Princess Nashma of our arrival, I'm afraid I must report a rather disastrous failure." Chapter 66. So, these two, then. Yours is shorter. Vadaryl, she grinned at her brother. "You wanna switch? I'm down for that." Venomox arched his neck, baring teeth. "Oh, I bet you are. Then when you lose you can complain endlessly about how it wasn't fair. No dice. It isn't that much shorter." "Are you sure? Look, this one is definitely a little." "Pa, that's barely a mouthful's difference." "Are we forgetting who was the one to complain first?" He hissed at her. She hissed back. A short distance away, Colin sighed. He had pursued them out in an arc just beyond the greatest reach of the cactopus, and positioned himself as close as he safely could without being in range of whatever violence was about to ensue. The others had followed, and now straggled to a halt around him, watching the squabbling dragons. "They really are." Isabeth trailed off, then shook her head. "I know you said so, but it's hard to credit. But there they are. Just so. So very. We all know what they're like. Everybody's met teenagers," Gigi said, grinning. "Damn, though. Not what I'd have pictured." Naren grunted noncommittally. Colin glanced down at Gigi as she stepped up next to him. "You're pretty brave, with the way you talk to them. Most people wouldn't be so casual with dragons." "Yeah, well, power is power," she said with a shrug, watching the two young dragons squabble. "Some people with power are real pretty about being questioned. Others sort of crave being talked to like a normal person, by normal people. Deal with enough kings and queens and you learn to spot the difference." "Well spotted," he acknowledged. "That sounds like a pretty high-stakes game, though. How'd you know they were the right kind?" Gigi turned to look up at him, raising one eyebrow. "Same way I can recognize you as somebody with the same knack. It's experience and instinct, and I think you know it." "I suppose so. I always like to hear how others get to the same ends, though. An old teacher of mine used to say that nobody is so good at anything that they have nothing to learn." "Smart teacher." He was, Colin murmured. Smart enough to make a potential problem disappear. Gigi gave him another thoughtful look, but said nothing, perhaps because the dragons appeared to reach an accord at that moment. Count of 3, Vadaril, she declared. No fire, no magic, no flight. Agreed. Alternatively, Colin called out, do all of that and have this done as fast as possible with a minimum of mess. Both of them swiveled their necks to look at him, then at each other, then rolled their eyes in unison, turning back to their chosen cactopus vines. Colin heaved a sigh and Naren reached up to pat his back soothingly. 3. Well. At least they're doing it, Isabet offered quietly. 2. Hells, I don't mind, said Gigi. This'll be a better show, I bet. Wait. Vanamax said suddenly. Do we start on 1, or a single count after that? Gigi burst out laughing so hard she apparently had to sit down. Vadaril, she looked at her brother in pure disgust, and opened her mouth to answer, but Colin yelled before she could. Just go. That, at least, seemed to be a good enough signal. Both dragons lunged, savaging the cactopus vines with fangs and claws. The first seconds were a blur of movement as shredded vine fragments were flung in all directions, the slender outermost reaches of the tendrils too delicate to be even a momentary impediment to the drakes. All of them backed away, mostly due to the fact that some of the cactopus shreds which became airborne were also suddenly bristling with spines. Fortunately none made it to the onlookers' location. Isabet continued backpedaling rapidly until she tripped on a rock and Naren had to lunge and grab her hand to keep her from falling. She didn't acknowledge him, keeping her pale face trained on the spectacle of 2 dragons unleashing explosive violence upon their target. It really was something to see. The cactopus wasn't fighting back, exactly, since it couldn't, but the effect was close enough. Every touch triggered that coiling reflex, resulting in both of the tendrils under attack curling themselves up into constant loops, so constant that they were thrashing wildly due to that and the repeated impacts of dragon claws and teeth. The vines twitched and whipped about, never relaxed long enough to uncoil, so they bristled constantly with their enormous spines, which thus inadvertently clubbed repeatedly at their assailants like enormous spiked flails. Those spines were no more effective against impervious dragon scale than the tough flesh beneath was resistant to dragon talons. Vadaril, she and Vanamax ripped and tore, repeatedly having to pounce as the vines' unthinking attempts to ensnare them just jerked themselves away time and again. Wow, Gigi murmured. Always a hell of a thing, when you can watch it unfold and see in advance exactly how it's all gonna go tits up. At her other side, Naren nodded. Colin just kept watching the drakes, tense and worried. He'd seen it too. The wild thrashing of the cactopus vines and the dragon's efforts to chase and shred them were going to lead to one inevitable conclusion. Vanamax was the first to get snared. He let out a trumpeting roar of pure outrage as a cactopus loop closed on one of his forelegs and clenched, trying to haul him forward toward the central body and shred him with spines. It actually succeeded, for a short distance, before he resorted to the undignified but effective measure of flopping onto his side and savaging it with all 3 of his other limbs, ripping the tentacle apart before it could pull him any deeper into its grasp. Vadaril, she paused in her own battle to laugh derisively at him. He didn't bother hissing at her, as that misstep had already cost him seconds and allowed her to pull noticeably ahead. He did spare her a baleful look, though, as he ripped into his own vine with renewed fury. There, see? It's fine. Gigi reached up to pat Colin's lower back. Dragon scales are just nonsensically tough. Not even tough like a cactopus, they are more magic than matter. Nothing that thing can possibly do would really hurt them. I am theoretically aware of that, he murmured. One thing I've noticed, though, is that dragons are more fallible and more vulnerable than they're likely to admit, even to themselves. Yeah, I guess you would know that, huh? But that's a plant, not a very specific kind of godling. And those are 2 drakes, not Atraximos the Dread. She rolled her eyes and threw up her hands. Okay, fine. Stand there and tense yourself into a knot, see if I care. Colin couldn't help cracking a grin at that, looking down at her. Sorry, Gigi. I appreciate it, really. I know they're not in danger, it's just something about this puts me irrationally on edge. The chef smirked. Is it the thought of what their mothers will do to you if you come home and tell them you let their kids get eaten by a big fly trap? You know what? I withdraw my apology, you smug harpy. She cackled gleefully and punched him in the hip. Lightly. Relatively lightly. She was the next to get snared, and she got it worse than her brother. The cactopus vine bent as it whipped toward her, accidentally evading her claws, and wrapped fully around her neck. The sight of it made Colin take a convulsive half-step forward, but luckily the vine had attached itself to the base of her neck, leaving her ample room to bend the rest of it down and rip into it with her teeth, swiftly freeing herself. The momentary impediment to her balance coupled by the pull of the coiling effect did yank her off her feet, though. It was Venomix's turn to laugh mockingly at her, though his sounded somewhat forced, a little too emphatic to be believable. She hissed at him, and lunged after her vine with renewed vigor. Seeing this, Venomix bounded forward and to the side, attempting to steal a march on his sister by attacking the thrashing tendril from the side, further up its length, rather than at the end as they'd been doing. Watch it! Colin exclaimed. Cheater! She shouted. Venomax had seized the section of vine in his jaws and grabbed it to either side of his mouth with both furry claws, easily ripping it apart, even though the vine itself at that distance was bigger around than his own tail. Green sap dripping from his fangs, he grinned at her. I don't recall we agreed to a rule against it. Then he squawked as the flailing length of fully severed vine touched and snapped around his leg, bristling with spikes. It was a reaction mostly of surprise. Those spikes obviously weren't doing any damage, and without the connection to the central plant it couldn't even pull him. He reflexively shook his leg before having to tear it loose with his teeth. Don't, and there she goes, Colin finished in exasperation as she took advantage of Venomix's momentary distraction to repeat his maneuver. It was then that Colin decided he'd better prevent them from getting into spats like this in the future. He had already picked up the impression that she was the more physically adept of the two of them, and now learned that went right out the window when her competitive ire was raised. If anything, she was less careful on her lunge than her brother had been, actually skidding on the sand as she fell upon the middle section of the flailing tentacle in a fury of talons. Unsurprisingly, this enabled her to cleave through it in half a second. Equally unsurprisingly, she immediately paid the consequences. Just as it had with Venomax, the newly severed vine whipped around and wrapped around her body, prodding thorns in all directions. She turned her head to grimace at the length of detached cactopus arm entangling her tail, hips, and one leg, still convulsing reflexively as it tried to coil toward a base it no longer possessed. She shook the afflicted leg stiffly, clearly gauging whether this would impede her enough to be worth taking a moment to tear it off, and in the momentary distraction, the still fully attached arm whipped in and struck her right at the base of the throat, almost exactly where it had snared her before. Instantly she was coiled around the neck and this time, yanked off her feet before she could begin retaliating. The vine dragged her across the sand, creating a ditch marked by claw marks where her squirming failed to catch purchase in the loose earth. Once more, Venomix laughed derisively at his sister as she was rolled over and pulled further, the vine managing to loop her body fully into a huge coil and compress her. She bared her teeth in fury, both at him and her predicament, now clawing at the loop of vine around her neck with her free claws while her back legs continued to try, and fail, to dig into the ground and stop her forward momentum. By this point she had actually been pulled forward past Venomax, fully ensnared by the efficient coiling of the cactopus, which meant there now remained a length of intact vine behind her. In seconds it had wrapped around her rear half, tangling up in her tail and legs, and on top of the rest of her predicament she found herself being twisted painfully in the middle as the vine tried to coil and drag her in two different increments. This, finally, brought a noise of anger and pain from her that might have been a roar were it not so strangled. It also prompted Venomax to pause in his own attacks to turn and look at his sister, not managing to paste an expression of mockery over one of alarm before anyone saw. "Pay attention!" Colin shouted, too late. Then Venomax was also being hauled forward with a cactopus vine snaring around his neck, chest, and one foreleg, dragged nose first along the ground right after his sister. "Okay, enough!" Colin exclaimed. "Game's over. Both of you, make with the magic, get out of those things." They were either stubbornly ignoring him or too distracted by their present debacle to notice. It was impossible to tell. Right as he was about to reach out with his mind to glean which it was directly from their emotions, she let out a noise that, while half-throttled, was a shriek of pain. Dragon blood was vivid crimson, faintly luminous, and smoked where it splattered to the sound. "Oof," Naren hissed in sympathy, wincing. Of course, no scales on the wing membranes. She thrashed as cactopus spines ripped into her pinned wing, shredding its sails. "Game is over," Colin roared. "So help me, I will not hesitate to tattle on you to your mothers." Pardon me if this is a stupid question," Elizabeth said hesitantly, "but do dragons need to breathe? Because, I mean, it's got both of them by the neck. And once it hauls them over the ledge, they'll be underwater." Colin flung his consciousness outward, seizing and assessing their conditions as thoroughly as he could. Anger, pain, stubbornness. But also, yes, dragons very much did need to breathe. Even as he tried to sort out whether they were still holding off magic on purpose, Venomax emitted a brief puff of fire that barely singed one of the ensnaring vines, effectively voiding the contest. It no longer mattered. Incredibly, they were both still so consumed by stubborn fury that Colin couldn't sense for certain whether they were deliberately withholding magical retaliation because of their stupid contest, even as he realized both were starting to lose consciousness from oxygen deprivation. Colin was dashing forward before he was aware of moving his legs. Yelling and waving their arms, both Harry and Elizabeth charged into his path. "Are you nuts? That thing is manhandling dragons. Do you know what it'll do to your ass?" "Hold still, let me freeze it." "Get off," Colin snarled, pushing Gigi away as she grabbed at his belt. "Those are my kids." All four of them froze, himself included. It was impossible to say whose expression was more incredulous. One of them had no time to dither about it, though. "You heard me," Colin snapped, stepping forward again. "Okay, fine," Gigi said, again grabbing his belt. "But use your damn brain. Use your magic. You can't do anything physically, so use your power." Elizabeth had already stepped as close to the thrashing vines as she dared, gritting her teeth in effort as she directed two torrents of blue-white energy toward the vines ahead of the two dragons, right where they dipped over the cliffs. It did seem to be slowing the plant's convulsions, at least by a bit. "My magic does nothing against. It only works on dragons, right? So use it on the dragons." "On the dragons?" He didn't know any. Teleporting to them wouldn't help here. Colin forced himself to stop. To breathe, to think. As the Lord Scribe had taught him. He could hear the echo of his old mentor's voice. You can always spare a moment to think. There's no crisis so great you can't make it worse by doing something stupid. Think. He had power over dragons. How was that useful here? Well, now that he was thinking, it was obvious. Colin seized both their bodies with his will and locked them in place. Against that power, even the gigantic strength of the cactopus was nothing. It was as good as trying to break time stone. Unfortunately, that meant all its pulling power was, instead of moving the dragons forward, compressing them against its coils. Venomax emitted a pained squeak. Colin almost let go, but made himself stop again. And think. Okay, it just needed subtlety. He was the master of dragons. They were extensions of his will. He reached out with his mind, reached deeper, made himself feel every detail of their condition and position. The way their bodies were being twisted and yanked, squeezed. And he set them right. The vines were mighty enough to contend with a dragon's own natural strength, but not with the will of a godling who now felt that rising surge of energy, that gathering glow and deepening connection as he did something that further advanced his burgeoning godhead. Colin ignored that for now, concentrating on what he was doing. He repositioned their bodies, expanding their lungs and throats, putting their limbs back into less painful configurations. Both dragons gasped frantically, air rushing back into them as the combination of their impervious scales and Colin's will overcame the plant's power. Closely aligned as they now were, Colin could feel their minds reawakening as blessed oxygen rejuvenated their blood. It seemed almost wrong that such intrinsically magical beings could have such a plain, mortal weakness, but he could give some thought to that later. For now, he focused deeper, and deeper still. He could sense their being, beyond the level of blood and scale and even magic, sense their existence, the weight of their presence upon the world, the resonance of every cell and fiber with magic and life and reality itself, all laid bare before his growing divinity. It was just like it had been with their father, in his final moments. Colin could feel the reality of them, feel the power in it. See exactly how he could push his will into their very existence and do as he had done to Atraximos. Expand them until they dissolved on the wind. Never in his life had he so carefully refrained from anything. Instead, he pushed. Ever so gently. Barely more than a brush, a caress. And then, with painstaking slowness as he observed how much they could take, a bit more. Then a bit more. Turning up the flow iota by minuscule iota, he matched his energy with theirs, not injecting them with divine power, but bolstering their own. Making them more dragon, until... With a roar, Venomox braced his claws on the ground and reared up on his hind legs, the massive cactopus vine entwining and rending in multiple places. With the augmentation of Colin's divine power blazing in him, the drake flexed his muscle and ripped the vines away in hapless fragments. Vaidarlshi was only a moment behind him, and slightly more restrained, given that one of her wings was still half shredded. Colin could feel the sharp, bright pain of it, a sensation that was all the more keen to her, unaccustomed as she was to actually being hurt. Pulling in a deep, careful breath, he let it out in an exhausted rush, finally pulling back his mind and power. Both dragons stepped a lot more gingerly away from their erstwhile prey, dividing wary looks between it and him. "Thanks, Gigi," Colin said, his voice shaking slightly. "That was exactly the reminder I needed. So, thanks. And sorry." "Hey, no worries, I totally get it," she assured him, patting the small of his back. "If it was my kids being eaten by a cactopus, I wouldn't care one damn bit that they were terrifying monsters, not in any real danger, and also not even my kids." Both drakes had returned to the group now, unmincing steps, looking uncharacteristically chastened. Venomox cleared his throat. "So. Thank you, Colin, for your assistance. If we could perhaps refrain from mentioning this to anyone," Vaidarlshi interrupted. "I can do without what my mother will say, and I can especially do without hearing Fenurixa bring it up twice a week for the next 1,000 years, please and thank you. I don't suppose." Slowly, wincing at the motion, she extended her right wing to the side. It was dripping luminous blood, hanging in veritable tatters. Could he? Colin hadn't tried, of course, but... Well, logically speaking, of course he could. Why in the world wouldn't he be able to? He concentrated again, feeling her entire state, including her uncharacteristically subdued emotional state, pride and mischief muted by embarrassment. As he had before, he felt out what she was or should be, that which made her herself, made her a dragon. And with that image so clear in his consciousness, it was the simplest thing in the world to put her back as she should be. White light flowed across Vaidarlshi's wing as reality shifted in response to Colin's will. Her body was magic and matter, and all of it flowed right back into its proper configuration in a second. Vadaril, she raised her neck, grinning and flexing both wings now. Ooh, nice. Damn, that was even cleaner than when healing magic does it. I've never had a shot of raw divinity before. Really? Venomox craned his neck to study her recently mangled wing in interest. I could almost regret not getting a chance to experience that firsthand. Just keep being yourself, kiddo, Geg suggested. You'll get there. I bet we could experiment, Vadaril, she said cheerfully. Hold still and I'll do you with my claws. Pants doesn't mind, do you, Pants? Colin took one step forward, planting a foot on the ground in a stomp that made the fabric of creation shiver ever so faintly. Faintly, but that such a thing happened at all immediately seized the attention of both dragons. He pointed one arm at the huge plant looming in the center of the river. Fire breath. On the central body. From a safe altitude. Now. He didn't get now. Both of them cringed backward from him, and for the next handful of seconds he didn't need to attune to their emotional states directly to fully recognize the sight of a pair of rebuked adolescents dragging out their response. Just to emphasize that doing it was their decision, and not because he had told them to. But then, in silence, both dragons turned and took wing to do the rest of it, and he decided that was not a battle worth picking. Naren patted him on the back. You're a good dad, Arkansas Colin Zeliker. Colin just sat down hard in the sand and flopped onto his back, staring up at the sky and listening to the nearby roar of concentrated dragonfire killing a giant cactopus. And that was when he remembered he could have just teleported them. Maybe. It would be best not to bring this up with their mothers after all. Tope continued.